So hopefully today we are going to complete Austin's take on uh, legal positivism. So yesterday we discussed about different kinds of laws that Austin talks about. Then we started with the definition of Austin's positive law, which he says is the concern of the sovereign. So we looked at the definition that has been given by him. So law essentially is the command of the sovereign. Okay. So for law to exist, there has to be a political sovereign. Okay. That political sovereign has to command, and that command has to be associated with sanctions for non-obedience of the command. So that essentially is the definition of law given by Austin, which is the sole concern of jurisprudence, as he says. And then he defines what is a sovereign. We already looked at the definition, and we were going to analyze different aspects of the definition. So before we go ahead, let's look at the definition once again, and then we will proceed. So his definition of sovereign is like this: that if a determinate human superior, not in the habit of obedience to a like superior, receive habitual obedience from the bulk of a given society, that determinate human superior is sovereign in that society, and the society, including the superior, is a society political and independent. So yes, the definition says that there is kind of a unidirectional flow of authority from the human superior to the human inferior. So yes, let's break down the different aspects of the definition then. Okay. So the first and most important aspect of his definition is that it has to be the sovereign has to be a determinate human superior. Okay, so it could be a single human, or it could be a group of humans. Okay, so that means that an absolute monarch can also be considered as a sovereign. So can a parliament, maybe with the president or along with the crown in England, okay, can be considered as the sovereign. However, what you are to remember and understand is that it is the legislator who is being considered as sovereign. Okay, because the sovereign has to give the law. Who gives the law? So whichever body is there that gives you the law, okay, and is a determinate human superior. Okay, so when he says determinate, it could be a single person or group of person, as we already discussed. Okay, and that lawgiver is this sovereign according to him. Okay, so whether judiciary comes within it, probably not. Okay, as you know, but judicial acts can be regarded as a case of delegated legislation. So judiciary can be authorized to legislate in those gaps left by the legislators. What would be the case of executives? Executives will be essentially inferior officials, okay, subject to the command of the sovereign, who are the lawgivers. Okay, so that's the sovereign. Okay, it has to be determinate, and then he says that it has to be human superior. Okay, now how important is the element of human here? Okay, for his definition, it is very important. But it is nonetheless, maybe it wasn't foreseen by him, but it is very much possible that in a not so distant future, you have some superior who do not look like humans, who probably do not have to look like anything, but is able to, direct and control your, actions. Okay, so maybe not so distant future, you will be under the sovereign rule of AIs, etc. Artificial general intelligence, maybe. So maybe then, if Austin was there, he has to, probably reconsider, his definition and include, any determinate superior rather than saying human superior. But essential point here is that why is he emphasizing on human superior? Because even God is considered as superior to human beings, but the laws given by God, okay, divine laws, are not the concern of jurisprudence. Hence, he is saying that it has to be determinate human superior. It cannot be a lion, it cannot be a tiger. So that's essentially the reason that he says that it has to be a determinate human superior. Then he says that receives obedience from the bulk of from the people, okay, the bulk of the people, okay, who habitually pay obedience to the sovereign. Okay, what does he mean by that? So idea essentially is that you cannot expect that if there were like 100 people in a society, you cannot continuously expect all the 100 to be paying obedience. There will always be someone who would not pay obedience. Okay, uh, so he's saying that all 100, okay, hypothetically, imagining a hypothetical society with only 100 people. So he's not saying that all the 100 have to pay their obedience. Okay, but if the bulk of the society, okay, if the bulk of the people, okay, habitually pay obedience to the sovereign, okay, then that is very essential. Okay, if the bulk do not pay obedience, okay, uh, or if in most of the times that the sovereign commands something, most of the people, okay, do not obey, or there is like general disobedience of the command of the sovereign. Okay, that means that the laws there, okay, if at all you want to call it a law, okay, which is the command of the sovereign, have become, laws have become ineffective. Okay, they're not worthy of being called law now. Okay, because the bulk is not paying obedience. Okay, this is something that quite often happens. Okay, and is also relevant under international law, as you're going to study later on. Okay, so there are certain situations where people do not pay obedience to the sovereign. Okay, of the kind that our thinker is talking about here. So it is quite possible that within a political society, people are divided. Okay, there may be civil war. Okay, like the way it had happened in the United States of America. Okay, so during that period of time, okay, during that civil war, okay, if there is any of that sort, okay, it is very difficult for us to identify who the people are really, paying their obedience to. So if such a situation arises, okay, where we are not sure who people are paying their obedience to, you can say that there is no political society, so there is no sovereign. Okay, and it is very much possible that after a while we see that some people pay their obedience to one superior and some to the other. Okay, then you can say that the political society has become two political societies. Now there are two sovereigns, and they have become two different independent political societies. Okay, they're no longer under the same sovereign. Okay, that's what he is saying. So that example has also been given in the reading that I have shared. Okay, so, and then if after, as it goes on, if it is possible for one of the sovereign to overpower the other and then starts receiving obedience from the bulk again, the totality of the bulk, okay, the bulk of the totality, then in such case you can again say that there is only one sovereign. So idea essentially is that someone has to establish some kind of supremacy. Okay, the moment one is able to establish that supremacy, you can say that sovereignty has been established. But if the same set of people start paying their obedience to different set of different determinate human superiors, then the political community has been divided into two. So that's essentially what he is talking about. So yes, so ultimately you have to see who the bulk of the people are paying their obedience to, and through that you can identify where the sovereignty really is. Then yes, another important factor is that superior cannot be inferior to another superior. Okay, if the superior is inferior to some other superior, then the superior is not superior enough to be called as sovereign. Okay, so he says the sovereign is not in the habit of obedience to any other human superior. Okay, if the sovereign is in fact in the habit of paying obedience to any other human superior, then that sovereign is not superior. Okay, and hence the command is not law. Okay, so that's a problem that quite often arises. Okay, so if you are of many federal forms of government. Okay, India is probably not the best case because it's not the traditional way in which federations form, essentially where different independent states come together for some common purpose like defense, diplomacy, etc. Unlike that, in India's case, it has been a kind of devolutionary, federalism. But anyway, nonetheless, we have states, okay, and then we have the center, okay, and it seems that and you have government at the center as well as at the states, okay. So what about such a system? If you are not happy with the Indian case, what about, for example, Australia, or for that matter, United States, where states come together to form the union, okay. In those examples, it seems that, okay, where exactly does this idea of sovereignty lie then, okay. So it's a problematic case, okay, which our philosopher here is not able to account for, okay. So if you were to ask Sovereign, so not Sovereign, if you were to ask Austin, what would he say? He will say that, okay, there has to be only one sovereign. So the governments at the state level, okay, they are not the sovereign. Sovereignty is at the center. But that's not what actually happens. Quite often you see there are certain enumerated powers, in favor of the state and then in favor of the center. In some legal systems, you will see that should there be conflict between the enumerated power, then the power of the center prevails, whereas in others, it's different, okay. Why am I talking about all this? It is essentially to point to you that we can, cite examples of, systems that exist, okay, which do not fit into the definition of, sovereignty given by Austin. But would we say that they do not possess law? That will be outrageous, claim to say that such a legal system do not possess law. But anyway, this is what the position of Austin had been. Okay. The next important point is that whether one can legally limit sovereign's power. The problem here is this, that what is law? Well, command of the sovereign according to Austin, okay? So can the sovereign command a law so as to limit its own power? Okay, that's a very important, philosophical question, okay, that quite often arises, okay. So, yes, Austin says that, quite often, sovereign, even the sovereign might be constrained by certain moral principles, okay, that it believes in. It's possible that there are certain constitutional limitations which are there, okay, or certain other principles of positive, morality which are there. The sovereign might consider, itself to be bound by it, to be constrained by it, but then that will be up to the goodwill of the sovereign, okay. We cannot say that there is some kind of legal limitation on the sovereign in such case, okay. Because it will always be open for the sovereign to say that I'm no longer bound by this moral constraints. Okay, so that's what he's saying. That he says that he would say that a legally limited sovereign is a contradiction in terms. Okay, so what does it mean? So there is an analogy, okay, that we can draw. Okay, when we say that God is all powerful, God can do anything, okay, then a question that obviously arises is that can God make such a stone which is so heavy that God cannot move it? So the problem here is this, that you cannot say that God cannot, okay, because God can do anything. So God can in fact make such a stone which is so heavy that God cannot move it, but then God can do anything. So can God not move the stone? Okay, if you say that it can move the stone, then you have to say that God cannot make a stone which is so heavy that God cannot move it. A similar kind of problem here that you see, okay. Can sovereign, legally limit itself, okay? You can say that, sovereign can do anything it wants, okay? So sovereign can definitely put legal limitations upon itself, okay? Well, then he is not really sovereign, because she should be able to do anything that he wants, okay? So that's the problem that we have. But unlike the case of God, here the situation is that we are in a practical case where we have only one conclusion that we can arrive at reasonably. It is this, that there cannot be no legal limitation on sovereign's power. Not even the sovereign, okay, who might say today that yeah, this is what I wouldn't do tomorrow, but there's nothing that prevents the sovereign from changing his mind and saying that okay, I will do it now. Okay, so that's what essentially is being talked about. And Austin would say that it just doesn't make sense to say that sovereign can be legally limited. If the law emanates from the sovereign, then sovereign can tomorrow make law to say that okay, what I said yesterday no longer applies. Okay, but is that what happens in the real world? Okay, not so much. Okay, not even in the country that Austin was in. Okay, England of today. Okay, the Supreme Court of England. Okay. Mm, Supreme Court of UK now definitely do not subscribe to this idea of sovereignty as has been talked about by Austin. We will look at that in a while. Apart from that, okay, in there are many other legal systems. Okay, so for example, the United States of America, India, where judiciary possess power of judicial review. Okay, so what does it do when it does judicial review? It essentially says that okay, when the legislature enacts a legislation, or it could also be executive action, but I'm not concerned about executive action for now. But legislative action, which is essentially the power of the sovereign that Austin deals with. Okay, so a legislation which is enacted by the sovereign. Okay, if it is not in accordance with the constitutional principles, okay, I'm just generalizing broadly, okay, as is the case, okay, then the court has the power of judicially reviewing and nullifying, invalidating such laws as being unconstitutional, okay. And the same applies to executive, but for us the essential part is the legislation, okay. So what happens then? What sovereign does is the ultimate, thing. Okay, so how can there be another branch that exercise certain power and invalidate that ultimate power which is possessed by the sovereign? Okay, well, that situation is not accounted for, by Austin's definition. So in fact, that problem did arise in many legal systems. Okay, so as you know, during Second World War and prior to that, during the Great Depression, when certain laws were brought about, by FDR's regime, then quite often the judiciary overturned such laws. Ultimately, although here, okay, I'm referring to the president, he's an executive, but then got enacted, laws through the Congress, okay, so which were not accepted. So in such case, what happens then? Okay, it is difficult for us to say, how these situations can be accounted for by the definition of sovereign which has been given by Austin. So that's a very simplistic idea of sovereignty that Austin draws. Okay, same has been the case in India, that with regard to property, there has been huge tussle between the in parliamentary system. You have executive and legislature mixed together, so you can say that's kind of legislature versus the versus the judiciary, and ultimately we got the basic structure doctrine. So it's very confusing to say what exactly, how to exactly, describe all this situation in the light of Austin's definition. However, as I told you, in the case of ADM Jabalpur versus Shivkant Shukla, the famous, or infamous habeas corpus case, the outcome of that judgment was definitely, an Austinian, sort of judgment, okay, but which was then overturned by another, in Puttaswamy's case. So how do we account for these complexities which keep unraveling? So yeah, sometimes Austin's definition, fits into a situation, but things change, and then again we have difficulties accounting for, his definition. So anyway, for now, you can say that okay, maybe theoretically it's it makes no sense to say that sovereign power can be legally limited, but in practice that's not the case. It very much is the case that you do not have sovereignty at a fixed point, okay, fixed number of people. It lies diffused, okay. There is always some kind of check and balance which exists, okay, in a system, which is not accounted for by the definition given by our fellow here, our philosopher here, John Austin. Then comes this question of the sovereign as it exists in most of the legal systems that we see today. Even those so-called sovereign are also bound by the laws that exist. Okay, how is that possible? How is it possible that a law exists? Okay, that law exists prior to the sovereign and it is binding upon the sovereign. But that in fact is what happens. Okay, so that is not accounted for by the definition given by Austin. So it's a very simplistic, definition which has been given by John Austin, but nonetheless essential for us. I mean, subsequent legal positivists will not be able to take their philosophy, their theory to the level of sophistication had it not been for Austin, who laid the foundation for positivism. Then coming back to the question of whether a sovereign can place a legal limitation on itself. Okay, theoretically, although it is, I just told you that it is not possible for a sovereign to place legal limitation upon itself, but in the case of England itself, okay, it proved to be otherwise. Okay, so in the famous case of Jackson versus Her Majesty's Attorney General, also known as the famous fox hunting case. Okay, so in England they have this despicable practice which is essentially practiced by the elites. Okay, in which they use bloodhounds to chase and kill fox. That's a sport that they love. Okay. Not quite liked by the commons, okay, not quite liked by the by others, okay. So it's a sport liked by the elites, okay, who essentially are in the House of Lords, okay. Now, by virtue of an act, okay, this practice was, basically banned, okay. So the law by which this practice was banned is known as the Hunting Act of 2004, okay. Now, before we discuss about this, there's a brief history needs to be looked at, how the idea of sovereignty evolved in England. So we discussed this earlier even in CLS classes. You know that by virtue of the Parliament Act 1911, certain powers of the House of Lords had been reduced, okay. What were those? That in case of money bills, okay, House of Lords doesn't have say, okay, and in case of other bills, okay, it can only delay the passing of the bill for at the most 2 years, okay. So that was under the Parliament Act of 1911, okay. Again, in 1949, another Parliament Act was enacted, as you guys already know, and by virtue of this act, that 2 years delay that was there under Parliament Act 1911 was reduced to only 1 year. Now the second act, 1949, was enacted by the the Crown in House of Commons. So the first act, 1911, was enacted by the the Crown in the Parliament, and the Parliament includes both the House of Lords as well as Commons. So by virtue of the 1911 Act, the sovereign, okay, as you may call it, okay, had legally limited itself. That in certain cases, okay, it's only the House of Commons, and the Crown in Commons is the law enacting body. Now that Crown in Commons enacted the 1949 Act, placing further limitation upon the House of Lords. Okay, and then under this particular act, the fox hunting, the Hunting Act of 2004 was enacted. So what's the issue here? Okay, so ultimately the matter was taken up before the court. Okay, so the question then remains is this, that whether the sovereign can place a legal limitation here. Okay, so the question then arises, who is the sovereign? So as you know, earlier the sovereign was the crown in the parliament. Now that legal limitation has been imposed by the crown in commons. Okay, subsequent legal limitations were imposed by the crown in commons. Okay, so the question is, can the can the sovereign impose legal limitation upon itself? Okay, so that is something that was to be answered by the judges. So here's the problem. Okay, by virtue of the 1911 Act, the body which was created, that is the crown in common. Okay, what body is it? Is it the sovereign, or is it a subordinate body created by the crown in parliament? If it is a subordinate body, then it cannot place legal limitation upon the original, the sovereign, that is the crown in parliament. So this is exactly what was to, decided. Okay, so there are certain quotations, but essentially one is essentially relevant for you. You will see that Baroness Hill said that if Parliament can do anything, there is no reason why Parliament should not decide to redesign itself, either in general or for a particular purpose. Okay, so essentially what she has said was that it is possible for the sovereign to put legal limitation upon itself. The same was agreed by almost all of them. Okay. Now, what would Austin say? Okay, would Austin be happy with this, this particular, statement that sovereign can, place legal limitation upon itself? Okay, if you were to ask, Austin, what would he say? He would obviously say that the said statement is wrong. It is not possible for the sovereign to place legal limitation upon itself. Okay, then what the hell has just happened? Okay. So the other option would be that the crown in parliament, that is both House of Commons as well as House of Lords, is no longer the sovereign. It is that the judiciary, along with the crown and the common, they have so they have revolted, and now you have a new political superior. Okay, what is that? It is that the crown and the common. Okay, and this is in fact what has been also asserted by certain other judges. Okay, so it's said here that the three of their lordships considered as much when they observed that the validity of the 1949 Act had been politically accepted by all the parties for more than half a century. So in this statement, there is a tacit, admittance of the fact that yes, there in fact is a change in the political superior, and the new political superior is no longer the crown in the parliament, but the crown in the Commons, House of Commons. So that's what essentially has happened. Okay, so but if you say so, then you are not negating, as I understood, you are not negating Austin's idea that sovereign is not legally limitable. Okay, so what has happened here then? Well, you can say that the sovereign has not legally limited itself, but there is a revolution and you have a new sovereign. Okay, and it is no longer crown in the parliament but crown in commons. That's what Austin would say. So Austin still remains vindicated until now. Now, the next important aspect of this, okay, so I didn't ask you guys whether you guys got it so far or not, okay, because I do not have much time. So if there is any problem, then you can ask me. If there is any confusion, you can ask me. Any confusion with the explanation so far? Students, am I audible? Okay. Then, yes.
Good morning, sir.
Yes, morning.
Sir, I have a doubt regarding Aristotle 5 modes of thinking that you have taught us.
Oh, not now. Not now, because we are in the middle of Austin, so I wouldn't revert back to Aristotle.
Okay.
Okay. So yes, maybe later on, once we are done with this, okay, I have to complete this topic. So yes, and then he says that the sovereign is indivisible, okay, because if the sovereignty is divisible, then you do not have one sovereign, you have multiple sovereign, and you cannot have multiple sovereigns in one political society. You have to have only one sovereign, okay. So there has to be a determinate human superior, and hence so the idea of sovereignty cannot be divided. But as we discussed earlier, okay, in the modern legal systems that we have, okay, modern political societies that we live in, okay, the power is not concentrated in one hand, okay, by virtue of a constitution, okay, power is quite often divided between three different organs: the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, okay. What about that? Can the idea of sovereign given by Austin explain this? Well, he can't, because um, in such legal systems where we have separation power, there is some kind of check and balance of power. Okay, so one organ acts as a check on the others. Okay, and thus we maintain some kind of balance of power here. In the absence of that, there will be absolutism. Okay, so Austin is kind of advocating for certain this kind of absolutism, which is exactly what we do not want in modern legal systems. Okay, and then when you have too much concentration of power, okay, so imagine if in the United States the Senate, the do you call it, the House of Representatives, and the president, who is obviously from the Republican Party, if all of them were from the one party, then in such situation, okay, it would have been very difficult. As you know, Trump is denying, not accepting defeat and denying transition of power. So it will be very difficult in such situation. So to avoid that, we essentially distribute power between three different government branches of the government. So you have their Supreme Court, then you have the Congress, then you have the executive. The same goes for our country. But then the problem is here as well. When there is too much concentration of power, then there is kind of autocracy. So look at the plight of the Supreme Court as we have today. Look at the executive, and yeah, of course, we are living in a parliamentary form of government where the executive and the legislature are more or less the same. So you have certain problems, and to avoid such problems, we have at least with certain hopes divided this so-called idea of sovereignty. But Austin is essentially talking about such a kind of sovereignty, which is absolute. So modern legal systems are kind of antithesis of what Austin is talking about. And when the sovereign essentially takes the kind of form that Austin is talking about, we have a threat to our liberties. Okay. So yeah, apart from that, another thing that that I already described that he's not able to account for is that the case of federations. Okay, what happens in case of federations? Well, it's not just horizontal division of power, it's vertical division of powers. So you have powers at the central level, and then you have powers at the territorial level. Okay, so what happens in those situations? How would Austin account for these cases? So yeah, it's very difficult for Austin to account for such cases, but he had probably made certain claims. Okay, so it said that the regional units, okay, the states essentially, and the federal government, Austin had claimed, are jointly sovereign in each and every unit of the federation. Okay, but that's nonsensical. Okay, in some, so it's probably the case. Okay, when you have the same party which is at the center as well as at the state, so you have very little likelihood of those at the state level going against the party ruling at the central level. But in those other cases where the parties are from the ruling parties are from the rulers are from different parties, okay, definitely such a situation cannot be accounted for by Austin. Okay, so anyway, In such situation, then would we say that there is no laws in this federal system? So, for example, Australia, India, United States, it's nonsensical to say that such legal systems do not possess law because there is no one sovereignty. So these are some of the limitations, okay, that the idea of sovereignty has, as has been developed by John Austin. One last problem that we are going to discuss today about Austin's sovereignty is that of the case of representative democracy. So here the example is given of England, but it applies to any legal system. Okay, so think about this country itself. Okay, so let's assume that for the sake of understanding, let's assume that the president in the parliament is essentially the sovereign, because that's the lawmaking body. Okay, now again we send our elected representatives there. Okay, those are the MPs, okay, who make the laws for us. So you can say that yes, the president along with the MPs of both the houses are essentially the sovereign because they are the lawmakers. Okay, but then they represent us, don't they? Okay, so ultimately they are accountable to us. Okay, so where does sovereignty actually lie? Okay, so we say it seems that they are the ones who give us who give us the law. Seems it's unidirectional, but then in a representative in a form of democracy, they are also accountable to the citizens, if not directly, at least during the elections they are. Okay, now the question of election is important. Why? Because who gets to vote is ultimately decided by the parliament itself by virtue of certain laws. Okay, but then who gets to make those laws are again decided by the electors. Okay, so it seems that it's very difficult for us to pinpoint exactly where the idea of sovereignty lies. Sometimes it seems that it is in the hands of those who have been elected, and sometimes it seems to be in the hands of the people who get to vote and elect their elected representatives. So yes, you cannot really pinpoint where exactly the idea of sovereignty lies. So the criticism here would be that his idea of sovereignty is too simplistic. Okay, but nonetheless, in many different cases, okay, many different situations, we have to, for that specific argument as it may come, we have to accept that yes, something of the sort called sovereignty does in fact exist, probably exist. Okay, probably not of the kind that Austin talks about, but for certain specific cases we have to accept the idea of sovereignty. So yes, ultimately the law takes the form of command. Okay, commands could be general. Okay, it could be general or it could also be specific. Okay, once there is a command, there will be a duty to obey the command. Okay, and if you do not obey the command, then there will be sanctions. Okay, that's the idea of law. Now this command comes from the sovereign. Okay, and it is imperative theory of law. Why? Because the command is an act of imperation. It's an act of telling you what to do. Okay, the command creates certain duties in you. But it is not always that all the laws take the form of commands. Okay, sometimes sovereign declare what the law is. Okay, so when it declares what the law is, it merely tells us what the duties are. It doesn't create any new duties. Okay, so are those laws then? Okay, we can say that yes, we have to say that yes, sovereign is merely clarifying what the duties is. So yeah, even in that act, you can say that it's saying what it had already had commanded earlier. Okay, so yeah, it is still a case of law, and he would say that we can justifiably include this within the province of jurisprudence. Okay, and then yeah, when a law is made to repeal an existing law, are those imperative commands? Okay, one may say that it is not, but we can even in those cases say that it is in fact a command. Okay, how is that? So now the sovereign commands that okay, my earlier command is not command. Okay, so by virtue of that, so for example, in this is what happens. Okay, an act had existed earlier, and that was repealed by another act, and then subsequently sovereign repeals the new law, reviving the old ones. So in all those cases, you can say that by virtue of repealing one command, it is reviving another old command. Okay, so in all those cases, even though directly you cannot say that these are cases of imperation, you can, by stretching it far, say that okay, maybe these are also cases of some kind of a command or imperation, act of imperation. And then there is something called laws of imperfect obligation. Okay, where it lays down duties but it does not talk about any sanction. Okay, even those were included within the definition of jurisprudence. Okay, but she should ideally not be able to. Okay, why? Because he says that this command is always associated with sanction. So if it is not there, then why should it be? So you see a kind of arbitrariness that exists in his definition that was given by him. So that's essentially what the idea of law is. And ultimately, he says that there is no connection between law and morality. So when a jurisprudent deals with law, he does not deal with morality. But quite often you know that the laws made by the sovereign does in fact reflect certain ideas of morality. Okay, but what happens when the laws which are enacted by the sovereign are so outrageous, so morally unacceptable? Okay, uh, what do we say of such laws then? Are such laws worthy of being called laws? Austin will say that yes, if you are asking me legally whether these immoral laws are laws or not, then I would say, okay, Austin would say that he would say that these are in fact laws, because we do not concern ourselves with morality here. The definition of law that Austin gives does not concern itself with the questions of morality. Okay, but if the laws are consistently outrageously immoral, then there is a high likelihood that people would not obey such law. It becomes ineffective and the sovereign ceases to be sovereign. Okay, but for that you have to wait and see what actually plays out in the society. Until then, until that happens, until revolution happens, until the sovereign is toppled, there is no question in saying that a law is not law, because it is not in accordance with certain principles of morality. But as you know, moralists, okay, those who say that law and morality cannot be separated. So, for example, Lon Fuller, they would say that nonsense. Okay, when the law reaches a certain degree of egregiousness, it is not worthy of being called law. But our positivists would disagree and say that no, we do not concern ourselves with the business of morality. That's a separate study altogether. So it does not matter. It is a law. So that's it. I'm sorry I'm moving a little fast, but I have to complete the syllabus and time does not permit me so far. So with that, we conclude our discussion on John Austin. And next week, we are going to, I think you have your examination. So after that, we will start with HLA Hart.